Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome to the 66th, that is 66, not 666, episode of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation once again with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, good morning.
Good morning. 66, clickety-click. We could have a go at bingo.
What happens if you get 666? You probably can't in bingo. I'm not a bingo player.
You can't. It doesn't go up that high, but as we all know, it's the number of the beast. There's always a footnote in the Book of the Apocalypse that says other ancient authorities read 616.
It'll be easier.
It was meant to be Nero, wasn't it? It was meant to spell out the name of Nero.
It is. The Seven Hills
Yes.
are meant to be the Seven Hills of Rome, and our listeners are no doubt waiting for an even deeper liturgical and scriptural exposition. But since we haven't got time for it, I could ask you instead at the outset that our listeners will all know the difference between adversarial proceedings and inquisitorial proceedings. But is it fair, or indeed usual, even in inquisitorial proceedings, for the inquisitor not to summon witnesses whose case may be essential to the decision that the inquisitor will reach?
I think you raise a very interesting question. I know more about adversarial proceedings than inquisitorial ones, because normally we have adversarial ones in this country. There's an interesting diversion around 1215 and Magna Carta and the Lateran Council, and how that leads to what it leads to, and the adversarial and inquisitorial systems adopt it in England and on the continent. But leaving that to one side, I'd happily come back to it because I think it's absolutely fascinating. It is always very important that systems appear to be fair, and therefore if somebody has witnesses, it would normally appear to be fair that those witnesses should be heard. There is also provision in standing orders that interestingly wasn't used for the Commissioner to appoint a panel, one of whom is a senior legal figure, to consider matters of disputed fact. And so many people have been raising with me recently questions about the process that affected Owen Paterson. And these are obviously important, and the House will have the opportunity to discuss them fully on Wednesday.
You've referred to Owen Paterson case, which is what I was referring to, in case any of the listeners had any doubt. Would it have been better if the Commissioner had formed such a panel, since the 17 witnesses Owen Paterson alludes to were not given the opportunity to present their evidence?
The Commissioner, in her report that was adopted, as you quite rightly pointed out in your piece this morning, by the committee, said that the witnesses weren't needed because the evidence that they gave wasn't relevant to the inquiry. And that is an interesting view to come to, because other people might say, how do you know whether it was relevant to the inquiry until you've taken their evidence and have found out the precise context of how things were done, particularly in terms of the debate, the disagreement between the Commissioner and Owen Paterson.
You're suggesting the Commissioner might have been mistaken?
Well, the House will have the opportunity to discuss this on Wednesday, and it's probably not right for me to prejudge what the House will decide. But these are the points that people have been raising with me in the last few days.
The motion on Wednesday, will it be amendable?
It's very interesting you ask that. The last time such a motion was amended was in 1947, and therefore there is precedence for amending a motion.
The Speaker would decide whether any amendment was in order, presumably.
The Speaker would decide on the selection of amendments, but the principle of is it amendable is one that there is clear precedent that it is an amendable motion.
Would you expect to see amendments tabled?
I really don't know. I don't know whether people have decided. I think people have differing views about what they want to do, and we will really have to wait until Wednesday. I'm sorry to be so cagey. I'm telling you what I know, and I don't know the full picture.
A historical question, since I'm fond of history, and you're very fond of history. Was there a free vote in 1947?
Well, in 1947, the amendment was to increase rather than to decrease the punishment from a suspension to expulsion. But I don't actually know whether it was a free or whipped vote. As you know, the technicality on whipping is that all whips are attendance whips. Advice may then be given informally, but whips are attendance whips.
Should this vote be whipped in the usual sense in which I'm using the word whipped?
I don't know what will happen. I don't know what amendments will be put down, so it's too early to say.
Is it appropriate that the government should whip a motion like this at all if the motion of the amendments are just simply concerned with the length of the proposed suspension?
Well, you're assuming that the government would want to whip against the motion. It might want to whip for the motion.
I wasn't assuming anything.
Okay.
I was just asking whether the government...
Look, I think the government always has a responsibility to ensure that parliamentary business is dealt with efficiently, in a timely manner, and that the reputation of Parliament and the government is upheld in all senses. And therefore, applying whips to individual votes, however serious they are, is perfectly reasonable. And there have been various conventions over the years that have waxed and waned. At one point, it used to be thought improper to whip on a constitutional vote. That certainly hasn't been the case in recent decades.
Let's move on from the Owen Paterson case to COP. Just by way of general background, as far as I can see, this was always going to be a very difficult COP, because unlike the last well-known one in Paris, it wasn't simply, so to speak, setting aspirations. It was actually asking people to put their money, so to speak, on the table. And the Chinese leader won't be there, the Russian leader won't be there. There's no reason to think that Russia or China or India, who are now going to be the main emitters, there's no reason to think they will reduce their emissions substantially. So I don't think of Boris Johnson usually as being an unlucky politician, but this is a bit of a short straw, isn't it?
Well, I mean, the Prime Minister has been very cautious in what he said about COP, but I think that there are straws in the wind that indicate things are going as well as you could expect them to. The US is being quite helpful. Australia has set a target for its own net zero achievement. So, as indeed has Saudi Arabia. So things are moving in the right direction. It's always very difficult with these conferences that when they actually hit, that is the tension point of negotiations and the point at which people have to move or not move. And we will see over the next fortnight how far people are willing to move and how much money they are willing to provide. I mean, the government has an ambitious target that there should be $100 billion a year provided for mitigations by the richer nations. The UK has announced that it will make its own significant contribution to that. And a great deal has been achieved. And the one figure that stands out is that at Paris, only 30% of industries were included if you went globally, and now it's 80%. So things improve incrementally.
But ultimately, Russia, India, China, those three countries are crucial to getting the rise in temperature down to the target, are they not?
All countries are going to be important, but yes, of course, the bigger the economy, the more important it is going to be. But pollution has its own cost. So visibility in Hong Kong and Shanghai from those amazing skyscrapers is not what it was 20 years ago. So there is a domestic incentive to deal with pollution as well as an international one. But ultimately, this way, I think Prime Minister got absolutely right. The key to making this work is getting the technologies that provide cleaner and cheaper energy. You've got to be about raising people's standard of living. This is why nuclear is exciting. It's why hydrogen is exciting, because if you can get those at a cost that is lower than or proportionate to fossil fuels, then you can be greener and more prosperous. And that's got to be our aim, not just for the UK, but globally.
We're in an agreement not to be reached, or an agreement to be reached that's clearly spatchcocked. How much difference do you think that would make to domestic willingness here to decarbonise?
Well, we've already achieved a great deal. So since 1990, we've reduced carbon emissions by 44%, whilst growing the economy by nearly 80%. So this combination is very important. The Prime Minister has said that he is not interested in hair shirt greenery. And this must be right. Nobody's going to vote for hair shirt greenery. They're going to vote for a sensible programme that involves technology that allows us to prosper and be cleaner.
What do you say when you go around local associations, as you still must, and people get up and say, well, you are imposing hair shirt greenery. I'm going to have to come off my wood stove or, buy my electric car, whatever, earlier than I would otherwise have to do, and I simply can't afford it.
Well, you won't necessarily have to sell your car. I mean, the target for cars is, I think, 2035. Now, that's not going to be a day at which no petrol is going to be sold. That's going to be the deadline for selling cars. And what you've seen is the technology as it's developed has got cheaper and cheaper. So wind power and solar power has become much cheaper over the last decade, 2 decades, than it was. Photovoltaic cells have fallen, I think, about 10% of the price they were 10 years ago.
So ultimately, hitting the targets is, particularly the further away ones, and whether or not they're reached, some of us won't be here to find out, but they are dependent on the prices continuing to fall, are they not? And on the technology basically working and being, in the case of, say, heat pumps, installable, not simply in new homes, but in old homes that weren't built for them.
And hydrogen may therefore be a much more interesting option, because hydrogen can be used in ordinary boilers and can heat your home effectively. And I believe you can put a very small percentage of hydrogen already in the mix of natural gas, but that if you can, you can with adjusted boilers or different boilers, use hydrogen as your source, then suddenly you've got a fuel that is extraordinarily clean. So, I think hydrogen is really, really important. It's fundamental to achieving these objectives. And the technology is there, but it's currently too expensive. Currently, hydrogen is 6.5 times the price of natural gas.
I mean, a skeptic would say, I'm not necessarily saying this myself, I'm just putting the case, you're gambling on hydrogen.
Not really. What I'd say is that we are assuming that human ingenuity doesn't suddenly stop in 2021. That's what we're gambling on. And if we go back, you're basically putting the argument of Malthus, aren't you? It's all doom and gloom, it's all terrible, and we must all ratchet back on how we live. But I don't think that's right. I think that the development that we've seen in technology is such that we can be confident that technology will continue to improve. If you look at this, you should interview Matt Ridley, actually, who's so good on this, knows much more about it than I do, is that we have increasingly moved to cleaner technologies just by market forces. So we moved from wood to coal to oil to natural gas, each one of which has cleaned things up. So if you take the London smogs in the 1950s, they've gone. They're a thing of history because we changed from coal to oil. So we've got incrementally cleaner in the past. Why should we suddenly stop getting incrementally cleaner now?
I think Matt's argument, and if I'm misrepresenting him, I'm sure he'll let me know, is substantially the same one that Charles Moore put in the Telegraph last Saturday, which was, why are we impoverishing ourselves now so that in the future people will be marginally less rich than they would otherwise have been?
We don't want to impoverish ourselves now. This has to be about economic growth. Has to be about technology leading to economic growth. That's the whole point. And this is exactly what the Prime Minister said in his article for The Sun newspaper a week or so ago.
What do you find Conservative activists say to you on this subject as you go around? Because in the United States, there's an enormous climate skeptic movement on the right. Here, it's very well represented in certain outlets. It's very well represented in the Daily Telegraph. We give it airtime on Conservative Home because we think we should. I'm rather sceptical myself about the targets, not about decarbonisation. But what do you find activists are saying about all this as you go around? Are they reflecting what many of them would read in the Telegraph, or are they saying something else?
It's very mixed. So I did a number of association events over the weekend, and for every person I had who said to me, this isn't happening, I had somebody saying to me, this is happening immediately and we must go much further. So that there is not a single Conservative view, but I do find that the expectation that we can do it through technology is one that has a wide appeal to voters. And this is fundamentally important because however green you are, even if you're a hair shirt green, you have to recognise that you have to get people to vote for this. And people will not vote to ruin their own standard of living. And therefore, if you are too aggressive, too hair shirty, that's an allowable word for Conservative Fame listeners, if you're too hair shirty, you'll find it won't happen. So you've got to work with the grain of public opinion, with what people are willing to accept. And that means, I think, increasing living standards through the efficient use of technology.
And just broadening the horizon a bit, this isn't made any easier reaching an agreement at COP, is it? By the fact that we're currently embroiled in the most extraordinary row with the French about fishing boats. What do you think is motivating Macron?
Well, I think it's late October-itis. You see, we have very important anniversaries at the end of October. So we have Trafalgar Day on the 21st and Agincourt Day on the 25th. And the French are always a little bit touchy at the end of October and get upset about things.
You think it's an Agincourt Trafalgar phenomenon, do you?
Well, I don't think we're expecting a victory on that scale. France is an important neighbour and a friendly ally who we work very closely with, particularly on defence matters. But Macron has his own political audience, and his Prime Minister rather let the cat out of the bag, didn't he, when he wrote to the President of the European Commission saying now is the time for the punishment beating. I mean, I paraphrase, but that's what he wanted. And Macron has always been hostile to Brexit. He's always been hostile to the freedoms that we have got. He is therefore doing what he can to stir things up a bit, but it's ultimately in our interests to have a sensible relationship with France and with the European Union.
Do you think it's a particular aspect of French/Commission thought, and as we know, the French have a certain amount of influence and input into the Commission, that one cannot be allowed to prosper if one leaves the European Union, or putting it less dramatically, but still quite harshly, that there must be a price to pay?
Well, isn't that what the Prime Minister said in his letter to the President of the Commission? Again, I paraphrase, but that was basically the message, was the UK can't do better outside than inside.
Do you think that's a French political view as a whole, or just Macron's own take with an election coming up shortly?
Well, very often foreign affairs are used as a means of distracting from domestic political affairs by governments all over the world. Wasn't there a great film called Wag the Dog, which you will remember? Cinema goes everywhere across the world will no doubt remember.
I'm now looking completely blank because I have never seen Wag the Dog. But
I think it was about an American president who decided to declare war on a small, faraway country because he was dipping in the opinion polls, possibly because of a scandal of some kind.
Because you're not suggesting there actually is going to be a war and that we're going to have
No,
to replicate
of course I'm not.
Trafalgar or Agincourt.
Of course I'm not.
Because you referred to both.
No.
Before you're misquoted, our report is taken up in the Daily Express or wherever.
No. I think it will calm down. I mean, the award of licences for fishing has been done extremely fairly. We've actually helped some people prove that they did fish. And you know all that's required to get a fishing licence in the 6 to 12 nautical mile zone is that you should have fished for 4 years out of 5, once in each year. So you only have to have spent a day's fishing. And of those who have been able to come up with the evidence, 98% of them have got their licences. So that's 1,800 licences issued. There are some people who simply can't provide any evidence of where they've been fishing. And you may want to ask why they don't have any evidence of where they were fishing.
Well, we'll see what happens and doesn't happen to that 2% and the remaining 98% when we meet in a fortnight's time. Thank you, Jacob, for another Moggcast.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.